Good evening. I'm David Sam, and I'm here in three roles. I teach creative writing here at Germanna Community College. I'm the vice president for this region of the Poetry Society of Virginia, and on behalf of both of those organizations, welcome to the Evening with Poetry. My third role is to serve as your MC. So we're honored tonight to have two outstanding poets reading to begin with, followed by open mic, in which right now much of that is going to be taken up by Germanna students of creative writing, most of whom have not read, many of whom have written poetry before. So first tonight, we're honored to have Professor Henry Hart, the Mildred and J.B. Hickman Professor of English and Humanities at William & Mary, who became the 17th Poet Laureate for Virginia just this year, I guess. It was the end of last year. It's according to some of the things I've read online, so I stole some off of the various places I looked. He is a self-proclaimed jock in high school who captained basketball, soccer, and baseball teams and earned all league and all state honors. Wasn't introduced to contemporary poetry until Dartmouth. Henry has 4 published books of poetry, the latest being Familiar Ghosts, has published biographies of James Dickey and Robert Frost, along with critical studies of Seamus Heaney, Robert Lowell, as well as numerous essays on modern poetry. So please join me in welcoming Henry Hart.
Amazing what you can find on the internet. I didn't know that my jock history would come up. But I'd like to thank David for inviting me tonight. I'm one of David's secret admirers, I think. I admire his poetry, but I also admire the fact that he does a lot of other things, and he has done a lot of other things besides just write poetry. He names some of the things that he's done and the things that he does. Now, I met David at a meeting. It was a Poetry Society meeting, and I remember him saying that he had been the president of a college, which made me perk up. I think I've always had what you might call president envy. I've always wanted to be the president of something, but it's partly because I really believe in service, academic service, governance. But I'm afraid at the College of William & Mary, when I get very involved with governance and service, I have a hard time dealing with all the egos that kind of float around like hot air balloons, you know, and all the political hassles. So then I just go back to my cave in silence and solitude, and I try to write. But when I first started writing poetry, I actually did get very interested in presidents. And this was when I was living in England. I lived in England in the late 70s, early 80s for about 7 years. And when people discovered I was an American, they just assumed I was a bad American. I think it's still kind of hard to be an American abroad. You get asked to explain America, foreign policy, presidents, American culture. And so I felt like I was being put on the spot, and I felt like I should learn more about America, American history. So I started reading a lot of books about American history, American presidents, and I wrote quite a long series of poems about American presidents. And I thought I would read one of those poems and then go on to some more recent poems. This is a poem about Abraham Lincoln, and it was inspired a long time ago by a trip up to D.C. to the Lincoln Memorial and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And in the poem, I imagine Lincoln kind of looking out at the Capitol. You know, there's a statue on the top of the Capitol of a woman, sort of a woman warrior with a sword and a victory wreath. She has kind of a helmet on her head. So I think of Lincoln looking out at the present, but I also think of him looking out at the past. I mention a girlfriend, fiancée, the great love of his life, Anne Rutledge. When Anne Rutledge died, when Lincoln was about 26, he was absolutely devastated. He became obsessed with, say, rain falling on Anne's grave. He would go to the grave and read the Bible, and apparently he had a pocket knife that he would finger. Who knows what his intentions were. I also mention looking out at one of his admirers, Walt Whitman, who tended to soldiers. I think they were Union soldiers from the Battle of Bull Run who went to D.C. and often they were just lying in the mud. They had hospitals outside and they were lying in the mud. And Walt Whitman, who was so caring, would give them food. He would write letters home for them, and then often they would die. So this is Lincoln in marble. No one shoos pigeons from his marble hair or sandblasts tears of soot from his cheeks. No sculptor chisels a stovepipe hat for his head. After staring so long at evenings double-crossed by jets and the warrior perched on the Capitol, his eyes go blank as chalk. He no longer reads the Bible or fingers a pocket knife as stars fall into the reflecting pool like snow on the grave of his beloved Anne. He looks away from the man in camouflage fatigues pushing a cart of amputated limbs from Bull Run toward cars filibustering up Rock Creek Parkway. Grass has faded to the color of old dollar bills where Whitman offered sweet crackers and raspberries to blue soldiers dying in mud. A floodlight polishes the bronze boot of a bandoliered veteran by the Vietnam War Memorial, splitting the turf like a beach destroyer. Lincoln is quiet as the time he threw away his flintlock and stood on a stump in a cleared field in Illinois, waiting for the right words to come. Actually, I read somewhere that Lincoln, when he decided to become a politician, did throw away his gun, and he would go out into these fields, stand on a stump, and this would practice his political speeches, just giving the speeches to the birds. Probably be a good idea if politicians today went out and just gave their their speeches to the birds. I have another poem about an American president, and this is John F. Kennedy. And I think I really kind of fell into a knowledge of the big bad political world right at the time I heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. This was November 22nd, 1963, and I was in third grade at the time, and we got the news through the loudspeakers, and we were told to line up outside the classroom, march down the hall to the buses. The buses were there very early, and then we were taken home. And I was 9 years old, and I remember some of my friends, I had never seen them cry before, and they were all crying. And so I knew something terrible had happened, but I was also kind of mystified by it. I did not know much about presidents and politics at the time. At the time, actually, in the class, we were rehearsing for a Christmas play. And for me, that was rather traumatic. The music teacher had given me a part in which I had to sing, and I think he knew that I had a terrible voice. I often say, when I sing, it's really like Bob Dylan on a very bad night. And the other students in the class made me quite aware that, yes, I had a terrible voice. So I was sort of upset about that. So I call this poem Mystery Play, and it's really a kind of creche scene. It's a play like old medieval mystery plays about the birth of Jesus, but it's also about the death of Kennedy. So, Mystery Play, November 22nd, 1963. It is almost Christmas. A blue woman kneels over the bandaged child, the hay ringed with wooden cattle. Above, angels flutter from windows. The star on the creche sticks its spokes into everything. How suddenly it happens, the faces rearing in judgment, the loudspeaker shaking with its terrible news. The buses wait in their arc of silence, ready to ferry us across gray rivers. It is almost winter. Again and again, I see his quiet face slumped in a cradle. Nothing will be the same. Windows darken into mirrors as we wait like birds over deepening seeds. So at the end there, I end with an image of seeds, and I'm imagining the seeds deepening into snow. I loved birds when I was growing up. We had all these bird feeders, and the birds would often scatter the sunflower seeds, and they'd end up in the snow. And then the next spring, they would often grow into sunflowers. So I was thinking about that, but I was also thinking of some of the historical seeds that were sown by Kennedy's death. I think a lot of stuff happened in the 1960s as a result of Kennedy's assassination. I mean, some make the argument that the Vietnam War blossomed because of Kennedy's death. So I wrote a number of poems about the Vietnam War. I remember that period as being a very confusing period. I was just talking to some other people about my father. My father was a colonel when he retired from the Army. He had served in World War II, the Korean War, and the National Guard, and he believed in the Vietnam War. He thought it was a justifiable war. We should be over there battling the communists. And he wanted me to, actually originally he wanted me to go to West Point and be a general. That was his standard line, but he wanted me to serve. He wanted me to have a war experience. And I was just trying to figure out what was going on in Vietnam, why we were there. I was reading magazines, just trying to figure it all out. So this is a poem. It's kind of a personal poem about Vietnam, but it's spoken by an older woman who is reminiscing about someone she knew in elementary school, high school. He's gone to fight in the war, and he didn't come back. She remembers a kite flying competition he was involved in at his elementary school, and also a romantic time that they had in a fire tower. There was a fire tower in my hometown, and all sorts of stuff happened in the fire tower in the evenings. So this is called the spring competitions. Above the elementary school playground, sprayed with white graffiti, among gravestones etched each year with a few more lichens, a few more cracks, Scott would dig in to hurl his pinecone grenades at children passers-by and watch the spring competitions. Once his unlaced black heads tripped over a pitcher's mound, and his kite's orange and yellow striped coral snake broke toward the fire tower on the town's horizon. Sullen, withdrawn, he roamed all day, seeking the prize of the lost competition. Years later, we drove the gravel road along the cliff at night, climbed cracked steps up the tower to lie above spotlit steeples. In a floorboard, he carved a heart, our initials, then threatened to jump. He played like that when I feared he might. After he left our small town of antiques and whitewashed churches, he sent home snapshots of rubber bags, helicopters over hills of charred trees, rivers clogged with silt. His face had hardened to a ridgeless nickel before he kicked the tripwire into flame. So I wrote, as I said, a number of poems about the Vietnam War. And some of these I wrote when I was teaching at a military college. My first teaching job back in the 1980s was at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. And I had been living in England for 7 years, so it was a bit of a culture shock to come back to the U.S. It was a culture shock to go to the Citadel. I had to put on an Army uniform. I was given a rank as a captain. I had to go through this very serious ceremony where I was inducted into a militia. It was called the South Carolina Unorganized Militia. In fact, I still have a certificate signed by the governor of South Carolina about me being in what the cadets called scum, South Carolina Unorganized Militia. They knew we were civilians. They often called us toy soldiers. But the implication was that if there was another conflict like the Civil War, then we would become an organized militia. So the Citadel has an interesting history. Perhaps some of you know about it. It was built after a crisis in 1822 in Charleston. There was a freed slave named Denmark Vesey who organized a slave revolt in a local church. And that church was in the news not too long ago because the white supremacist Dylann Roof went to that church, and as you know, he shot a number of African Americans during a Bible study session. So Denmark Vesey's slave rebellion never got started. It was discovered, and then Vesey and about 30 of his African American cohorts were executed. I think they were hanged. And then the white residents of Charleston thought that if there was another slave revolt, if there was an actual slave revolt, they needed a local militia to put down slave revolts. So that's how the Citadel came into being, to train locals, to train a militia. So I spent 2 years in Charleston. If you've been there, it's really a very beautiful place. All these beautiful houses by the bay. But you look at them, and if you think about the history of them, those beautiful houses were built because of the money the plantation owners earned from slave labor. So I had a lot of very conflicted feelings about Charleston and also the Citadel. So I wrote a poem called A Short History of Charleston. I mention a couple of churches. There's one church, St. Philip's, an Episcopal church, where the slave owners, the plantation owners, would have gone. I mention Gullah, which is a kind of Creole hybrid language, English mixed with African languages. It's what the slaves would sometimes speak. I mentioned somebody named Mr. Pinckney. He was a plantation owner, at least in the poem. And then I also mentioned Henry James, the author. In 1905, Henry James went to Charleston. He wrote about it in a book called The American Scene. And Henry James was haunted by what had happened in Charleston and near Charleston during the Civil War, because his brother, Wilkie, was wounded and he was traumatized. He never really recovered physically, psychologically, from being wounded at Fort Wagner. So this is a short history of Charleston. Mr. Pinckney stoops to speak to her in Gullah, my pickaninny, my sweet pickaninny, her blue shawl crumpling around his boots. They're having sex. Her breasts are brown as acorns, in light reeking of sweat and wood smoke. As she cries, he pushes her against brick until the fire weakens under the stew pot and a horsefly slams against the wall. Wiping his hands, he saunters back to the veranda. It is Sunday in Charleston. Mr. Pinckney holds the carriage door for his daughters, praising the magnolias as they drive to St. Philip's. In another church, Denmark Vesey preaches to slaves on Joshua, how ox, sheep, and ass will lie down in the gutters with their master's blood. A witch doctor blesses them with crab claws as harnesses on Mr. Pinckney's horses twitch like nooses on a scaffold. The salmon pink teeth of the Citadel's turrets cut a clean shadow on the parade ground where the sun has burned the grass to a tundra. Cadets halt and swivel in gray formations. From a distance, Henry James admires the pattern, then turns towards a beach of exposed wreckage. Light flashes on dolphins by the island fort, where his brother Wilkie still limps with a canister ball in his ankle. Stately, plump, Henry strolls under palmettos, weaving a sentence heavy with the scent of magnolias and the imagination of disaster. That was actually a phrase Henry James liked, the imagination of disaster. He hears the cries of slave ships in gulls, glances at a stone lion among poinsettias, its teeth knocked out by the shock of cannon. When his Pullman chuffs from the station, he notes the magnolia buds are hard as acorns and orders tea in an English accent. So, yeah, I had quite conflicted feelings about Charleston and the Citadel. I was just saying I was there for 2 years. I was going to leave no matter what. My brother was in publishing in New York, and I was hoping maybe I could get a job in publishing. My father, on the other hand, was very proud that I went to the Citadel because, of course, he always wanted me to have a military career. He gave me his army uniform, which didn't quite fit because he was smaller than me. And I've written a number of poems about my father, partly because he died in December. But I always had a hard time figuring out why, at least in his stories, he romanticized war the way he did, because he had seen some of the most horrendous episodes of World War II. He was in the Philippines, and then the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he and his platoon got orders to go to Hiroshima. Now, this was just a few weeks after Hiroshima, the city, was decimated by the bomb, and the order said that he was supposed to, with his men, destroy warehouses that were full of guns and ammunition on the outskirts of Hiroshima. He always told me that the bomb had partly destroyed them. In fact, the bomb had moved them on their foundations. But there were still guns, there was still ammunition, and the fear was the Japanese would get the ammunition, get the guns, and continue fighting. Back around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was the fall of 1962. My father wanted to impress upon me how terrible a nuclear attack could be. And of course, the fear at the time was nuclear missiles might strike the U.S. So my father got out his slides of Hiroshima. He had walked all around the city. I was telling somebody earlier that the bomb project was very secretive. They knew nothing about radiation. They weren't told about radiation. So anyways, yes, I have vivid memories of seeing the slideshow in our living room, seeing the devastation of Hiroshima. So this poem is called My Father's Slides of Hiroshima. My father always pronounced it Hiroshima, but smoke uncoils from his cigarette, dimming the projector's beam, the sheet taped to the living room wall. I sip grape soda, nibble a saltine cracker. The bomb was nicknamed Little Boy, he says, raspy, matter of fact. We got orders to steamroll guns and ammo in warehouses the bomb didn't flatten. Nobody talked about radiation. I gaze at a tree scorched to a black clump of wires, bricks scattered like teeth around the skull of a cathedral. Smoke stings my eyes, blurs a body x-rayed on a sidewalk, a dog licking a girl's ankle stump. Outside, the moon turns our Norway spruce behind the spring house to the color of Hiroshima's ash. My father warns nuclear missiles from Cuba could hit cities near our town. I say nothing. On the hearth, our beagle gnaws a lamb bone, her teeth clicking like slides. My father keeps pushing through the projector. So I was very young at the time. I was 8 years old, and you see something like that, and you think, my God, what'll happen? So, yeah, my father died, as I say, rather recently, and the last time I saw him in a hospital in Torrington, Connecticut, he was telling the nurses about Hiroshima, what had happened there and what he had done. So I think the experience haunted him, even though in his stories he always romanticized going to war. He thought it would be a good idea if I did that. But I don't, in reality, I don't think he romanticized the war. In fact, after the war, I think he wanted to get as far away from violence and actually human beings as he could. I learned recently that he had wanted to be a homesteader in Alaska. My mother told me that. He never told me that. In a way, he became a kind of homesteader in New England. He bought a cottage on a farm, an old farm, about 12-acre farm, and moved in. And at that point, he had a job as an engineer. He was a very talented builder. But the cottage had no electricity, it had no plumbing, it had no phone, it really didn't have anything. There was a pipe that had water that would come to, I think, the bathtub just by gravity. You know, they'd open a valve and a little water would trickle. Anyways, gradually in the early 1950s, he built a house around the cottage. He did install electricity and running water and a few appliances. And then in the late 1950s, he started planting Christmas trees on the old farm. And when I grew up, I planted a lot of Christmas trees, pruned a lot of Christmas trees, sold a lot of Christmas trees. And even when my father was in his late 80s, he would go out and plant Christmas trees. It takes about 7 years for a Christmas tree to grow high enough so it can be sold. So my mother used to make very sarcastic remarks about how my father must be very optimistic if he's planning to sell these Christmas trees he's planting when he's 89 or 90 years old. In fact, I go home now. I was just there about a month ago pruning our remaining Christmas trees. We don't sell them, we give them away now and take donations for a local scholarship. So this poem, again, mainly about my father, is called Late Planting, but it's supposed to be spoken by my mother, especially when they were talking about going to an assisted living facility. Late planting. He thinks he's still 30 and can plant an acre of seedlings in an afternoon, even when the sun wilts the strongest black-eyed Susan in the field. Yesterday he lost so much salt he couldn't sleep. Weak from that bad operation on his hip last summer, his legs knotted up with cramps. I asked why he kept planting Christmas trees, since he'll be too old to sell them when they're grown. He said they give him a reason to go on living. I told him all our best friends from church had signed up for the new retirement home behind the Ace Hardware store in town. He said they'd have to drive him there in a hearse. And besides, with new spray and mulch, he could cut the time to grow a good tree in half. When I went down to say it was time to quit, he coughed until his sunburnt face grew redder. It's the ragweed, he huffed, waving me away. I need to get these last trees in before this killer heat burns their roots. I told him tomorrow he'd be 89 and the grandkids were coming for a party. He said the rows of spruce could be the candles on his cake, then swung his planter's blade down hard, kissed the roots for luck, and stamped the dirt. So going back to the war theme, and my father, in 1968, just after I turned 14, and this is when the Vietnam War was raging, my father sent me on a 1-month trip to the Allagash Wilderness. It's called the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. And his hope was that I would get training, sort of survival techniques that would help me when I became a soldier. And one thing we did do during this month-long trip, we were told just to go out. It's like a solo on Outward Bound. You just go out, I think, with a knife and some matches, some string, and you survive for a few days. And we began staying in a cabin, and that's where we got training for the canoeing, the camping, the hiking that we did later on. And there was a buddy system, again, it was kind of semi-military. And so I was assigned an older buddy who had been on one of these trips before. And I think his idea was that I was just this young kid, I just turned 14, and he was going to haze me, bully me. I had never really been bullied the way he bullied me. So the first night in the cabin, before he even got to know me, he put a cigarette out on my neck. And I remember that vividly, and just how we were just off in the wilderness. There were no cell phones. I mean, I couldn't call my mother and say, "God, you got to come pick me up. I'm out in the sticks with a bunch of sadists." That wasn't possible. And things didn't get much better, although a little bit later things changed because this crazy buddy of mine decided to show off his diving skills, and we were close to an old dam that was being reconstructed, and the construction crew had made a diving board on a huge boulder, and he just ran down to the end of the board and jumped, and his head hit a rock, and he came out, blood all over the place. The construction crew had to call in a pontoon plane, and he was flown away. I didn't think he was coming back, which was a good thing in some ways, but that would have meant I would be paddling a 20-foot Old Town canoe full of stuff almost all the way to Canada, and we were about to enter the rough part of the river. But then he came back, and his head was completely encircled with gauze. So in this poem, I'm imagining going back to the cabin where we trained, and I was told the cabin was in ruins. So that's how it starts. Title: What I Should Have Told the Hypnotist About the Allagash. 20 miles of dirt ruts end where my father hoped I'd train for war. Nothing remains of the cabin but weeds and balsam fir rooted in the timber's rot. Nothing shines but cracked panes where the moon once crawled through sleepless nights of smoke. One plank carved with names points to the table where I held a one-eyed jack and suicide king behind a stack of nickels. I was playing poker when he put the cigarette on me. If I dig, I could find coins stamped 1968, glass eyes of trophy moose and trout from nailed-up plaques glaring from the cabin's mulch. The soil is dark as that first night our counselor paired me with my buddy Harold. Rain and snow have warped the floor where I passed out and woke to ash from the cigarette I punched from Harold's fist after he pressed it against my neck. The chimney still drones as it did for hours while Harold snored. The river still runs silver over rocks, scarred red by our canvas old towns. Old fires have whittled the trees to spines on the mountain where we stalk shadows in our moonlit war games. A timber company has repaired the washed-out dam. Now the pond slides down a flume into a pool clogged with silt. The boulder with rusted bolts by the shore no longer holds the board where Harold bragged he dove off Acapulco's cliffs. Only the shadow of a birch plunges into shallows. Only an eddy swirls where Harold split the water and staggered to his knees, trying to catch the blood spilling from his head. A hum in clouds could be the float plane flying him beyond the woods or flying him back, his scalp mummified in gauze. Perched on a pontoon, a cigarette trembling in his hand, he said his father was too drunk to drive him home from the hospital, and he knew I couldn't paddle to Canada alone. Those final weeks, he no longer grabbed me in my sleeping bag, no longer shouted from the stern, "Pull left, pull right." After we hauled canoes through rapids shrunk by drought, and a bloodsucker stained my Converse sneaker red. After gray scales inched from the burn mark on my neck across my chest, a counselor told me I should talk to a hypnotist so the scales would begin to flake. It's actually true. Because of the drought, we had to drag the canoes through the river, and the river was full of bloodsuckers. And one time I got out, and I looked down. I had low-top Converse canvas sneakers. One was white and one was red, and I didn't know why. And Harold laughed. I took off my shoe, and there was this big bloodsucker on my instep. So maybe I'll read one more poem, and then. So yeah, when I go off on my adventures, I always have misadventures. This last poem is about going to Inner Mongolia in the Gobi Desert. Believe it or not, a lot of my relatives lived in Mongolia and in China. My grandmother was born in a house whose back wall was the Great Wall of China. And back in 2004, a Swedish friend of mine proposed retracing an expedition route that my great-grandfather was on back in 1927, 1928. He did all sorts of things in Mongolia and China. He often led expeditions. He helped lead the expeditions to find the first dinosaur eggs in the flaming cliffs of Mongolia, and he worked for the living Buddha, the emperor of Mongolia, and first president. He did all these amazing things. Anyhow, this poem begins in Williamsburg at my 50th birthday party, and I was telling a friend I was planning to drive across the Gobi Desert all the way to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and he told me, Henry, you're obviously having a midlife crisis. If you want to go to a desert, buy a red Corvette and drive to Las Vegas. And perhaps I should have. We had a driver and a guide. The driver had a problem with sleeping. After lunch every day, he would begin to fall asleep as he drove. And then the guide had absolutely no idea how to guide us cross-country. We weren't on roads through the Gobi Desert. And we got lost, and he got very upset. He lost face, and we thought he wandered off into the desert for a while. We didn't even know if he would come back. He did come back, though. And then we encountered the Chinese military police. So I'll read this. It's almost like a prose poem. It's like a journal, and almost everything, believe it or not, is true. Gobi pandas. A friend of the party said, if you want a midlife desert experience, rent a Corvette and drive to Las Vegas. We've been talking about my great-grandfather's expedition through the Gobi, how he charted winds with weather balloons so the Luftwaffe could fly from Berlin to Peking. In 2004, on the back seat of a beat-up Land Cruiser near Mongolia, I watched our driver's eyelids in the mirror flicker after our last lunch of beer and cookies. We ran out of food. For days, water and diesel had leaked from roof tanks. Gobi dust had thickened into a camel pelt on windows. Our driver parked by a ravine, popped the hood, and spit at the radiator's steam. The guide squinted at his KFC compass, a gift from his daughter in Beijing, and smiled. Tonight you sleep with Miss Toyota. Then he opened the door and walked into the desert. Stars lit the dark like candles in a cathedral. At dawn, he tapped my window, whispered about a trail of salt he'd followed up a dry river to a yurt where a nomad gave him fermented camel's milk and directions to a village beyond the mountains. We followed the sun toward windmills on a ridge, drove down switchbacks to mud brick huts by an oasis where my great-grandfather had built a lean-to from camel blankets, tied bells to dogs to scare off wolves, and butchered 2 camels during a 4-day blizzard. On the only street, t-shirted men played pool, never looking up from their rickety tables. Inside the one restaurant, waiters refused to speak when we pointed to ox tongues, donkey dumplings, and sheep lungs stuffed with rice behind a counter. They served tea to 3 military policemen who marched through the door, took our passports, and told us we must be spies selling Mongolian guns to Uyghur terrorists. And if we continued tracking my great-grandfather's route through the desert, they'd machine gun our Land Cruiser. And if we refused to leave on tarred roads by dawn, they'd order a strike from a missile site or jail us. On the way back to the car, our guide paused by a temple and said, "Do you hear the bell? The Buddha says, in this desert, you are a Gobi panda." So, yeah, that all actually happened, and the guide explained the Gobi panda reference. Basically said, you, a foreigner, you're like a goby. I mean, you're like a panda. You should not be in the desert. You should get out of here. So I'll get out of here. Thank you very much. Oh, Q&A. Q&A. All right. I was going to let Laura read.
Have an opportunity now for questions for everyone. Please use the microphone. Raise your name.
Don't be shy, the way I used to be, very shy. I would never have asked questions. But you go ahead if you want.
So many of your poems are stories, and the storytelling that you give us before the poem adds a lot of richness to the listening of the poem itself. And I'm interested in how you start with the sort of grain of an experience, a grain of a story, how you hone that into a poem, and how that's different once it is a poem.
Right. Well, it's funny you mentioned that. Members of audiences in the past have sometimes told me they prefer the stories to the poems. So, yeah, maybe I should just tell the stories and not read the poems. Well, one of the reasons that I introduce poems is because of my experiences in college, and actually recent experiences at William & Mary, where I invite poets to read. And sometimes poets will get up and I remember vividly going to a reading by John Ashbery when I was in college. He walked into the room, he didn't talk to anybody, he got up, he just read his poems, and then basically he left, and we were all bewildered. And actually that still happens now when I invite poets. They'll just stand up, read the poems. I always have a very hard time processing a poem when it's read. You know, if I'm reading a poem, I can sit there and I can think about it, I can make sense of it. So I feel, I don't know, maybe this works, maybe it doesn't, but I feel if I introduce these story poems with a story, maybe you'll understand them better. So yes, I do start with some experience. Yeah, it's maybe like the grain of sand, and then I try to layer the grain of sand with something like a pearl. And yes, sand, it irritates you. And I think I often do write about stuff in my past that has irritated me. I think poetry has always been somewhat therapeutic for me, dealing. I know at the beginning of my writing in college, it definitely was therapeutic. When I went off, I grew up in a small town, a farming community. Yes, it's true. I was a jock. I know I got into college because of my athletic abilities. My academic abilities were not so strong back then. And here I was at Dartmouth, where for me, I played on the soccer team and I skied as well. It was very competitive athletically. It was very intense, very competitive academically, and I struggled. And then my very first teacher in my very first English teacher in the English literature class that we all had to take was a poet who had studied with Robert Lowell. And I had never heard of Robert Lowell. I'd never heard of any of the contemporary poets because poets weren't really taught at my high school. And it was a revelation. And he was so nice to me. And he encouraged me and became a kind of a mentor. Poetry, reading poetry, writing poetry helped me make that transition, from where I came from to where I was. My grandfather, who spent a lot of time in China, he used to translate Chinese poetry, and he wrote poetry too. He used to always complain that there wasn't enough story, not enough narrative and poetry, and that sort of stuff. I like stories, yeah. So a lot of the poems are story poems. Other questions? Well, Laura, I should let you read.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. And Henry probably will, depending on his schedule, he may be able to sit out front with some books. If you'd like to take a look, maybe buy one, have it signed. Next we have Laura Billenock. How did I do?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. Billenick?
Yeah.
I screwed up again. Oh well. Laura Billenick, the author of 2 books of poetry, Warp, which won the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2015, and is it A over Zero?
That's right.
Her poetry has appeared in Best New Poets, Ninth Letter, Pleiades, Runica, Crazy Horse, and many other journals. She has a Master's of Fine Arts from Johns Hopkins, a PhD from the University of Utah, and currently serves as Assistant Professor of English at Mary Washington, where she teaches creative writing classes in poetry, poetic forms, and some writing workshops. So please join me in welcoming Laura Billenick.
That's great.
Laura.
Thank you.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, big thanks to David for inviting me out to read, and to Henry for reading those delightful poems and telling us your stories. And thank you all for coming on a Thursday night to listen to poetry. What a special thing to get to sort of live in a room together and be attentive to language. It's not something that happens every day. I'm going to read for a little bit less time, so I'll be reading for about 15 minutes. You can bear with me. I'll read a few poems from my book, Warp, and then I'll read you some of the poems from a new project that I'm working on. To give you a little bit of context for the book, Warp, this book started, it started way before this happened, but the book sort of gelled in a moment when I was reading the Oxford English Dictionary, which is something I do when I don't know what else to do with my time, which is no longer the case because I have a baby now. But at that time, I was looking at the dictionary entry for the word warp, trying to really just like hone a particular image. The details maybe of that are not as essential, but there were 54 definitions for the word warp, many of which were obsolete, the majority of which were obsolete definitions, but really unusual definitions like of bees to swarm, to strike down. Stuff that just made no sense, but it was a common verb in Old English, and that's why there were so many. And I decided I was going to try to write a few poems sort of thinking about the way those hidden meanings inflect a word that is a real word in English, and to see what comes out. So most, but not all, of the poems in this book do have an epigraph, which is a definition, one of the definitions of the verb warp specifically. Like I'm not even counting the noun or any of those other fun things that can happen. But that's one part that holds the book together. And then another part, many of these poems are set in Mexico. I lived there for several years. My husband is from there. His family has land out in rural Mexico, a couple of hours north of Mexico City. And so the first poem I'm going to read tonight came out of a story that is not my own story, it's his story. And it's a story of his grandmother falling and what happened when she fell. And there's a mention of a cross in a church. That's a real place in my husband's hometown, where this particular crucifix is said to be growing constantly, just very, very slowly, but enough that you have to sand it to keep it the same size. And so people sand it, and then that dust that comes off of it is considered to be holy, very, very special dust, miraculous dust, in fact. The definition that inflects this poem, it's a long one. It's hard to believe this is the definition of warp, but it's to thrust one's hand forth, to lay hands on, to cast down, to strike a stroke, obsolete. The title of the poem is Luz, which means light, but it's also a name. And there's a little bit of play in Spanish that I should tell you about too. So, te ruego would be I beg you, and te riego would be I water you. So there's ruego and riego, and there's a little bit of movement between those two phrases. So, her blood was water. There was water all over the floor. When I found her, I ran hands through her damp hair, ran to the street, ran my eyes up to the muscled sky, a thigh flexed, squatting over us. God, as a nurse with her fingers already on the bone, snapped, "Andale, get over here and help me lift the body to disinfect the wound." Before she died, her blood laid its hands on the steps and on the rain barrel, on the tile in the garden. Te riego, I heard her tell the lime tree flowering in the yard. Before that, before she fell, before she died, she swelled. Her ankles and her fingers grew like pale tubers, thrust from the soil too soon. She salted everything she ate, and her rings bit into her skin, and her skin grew over them. In the church, I saw her sanding the feet of Jesus from a crucifix to collect the sawdust in her handkerchief. And so she salted her tea and her tortillas with, she said, a holy salt, a tasteless salt from her pocket, pinched and sprinkled on cakes and on eggs and in milk, until she swelled so much she prayed for us to bury her, but let her keep her rings, her wedding ring. When she fell in the garden watering the plants, she prayed and fell against the garden wall with her hands full of soil and salt like seeds. We disinfected water to disinfect the wound. The blush of iodine droplets in a bowl clarified to nothing more than prayer. Te ruego, to the water, to the nurse, and on her lips I heard her say, Te riego. In the church I always saw her, absent-minded, touch her own hands as if to touch something under the skin. At the funeral, her hands were laced in gloves to hide the stitching where a finger was sliced off to take a wedding ring. If in the church there was blood, her blood was colorless. On the white lace and on her skin there was no mark to recognize by blood our hands can hold water, or gold, or seeds. Our hands hold earth. I'll read one more that's set in Mexico just to make it sort of a theme. This one is called Harvest. And it comes from a story, but some of it is fiction. It comes from a story that's real, which I was on a long walk in the countryside, and the neighbors had a dog. It was a Doberman, And he was a friendly dog. His name was Milo, and he liked to walk with us. But this particular day, we didn't set out with him. He just sort of caught up with us and was sort of walking, following us along. And we got a long ways out away from the house, and he was there. And suddenly, in the distance, there was this tiny dot moving really close, really very quickly toward us. And so we sort of got up on the separating walls that partition all the land out there, and I said, I think that's a ram, and it's coming at us like really directly, and it was bolting toward us, and Milo the dog started bolting toward it, and they ran toward each other full speed, met in the air. I mean, it was like the ram rammed the dog, and the dog tried to bite the dog, or bite the ram. The ram won. The dog was not killed but hurt and was a little bit offended. So on our way back, he ended up killing a sheep. He ended up stopping a herd of totally docile, friendly, small, nice sheep, running them around and caught one and killed it. And we ended up having to buy that sheep from the owner because it's a source of income for these farmers, and so we said we would pay for half the sheep if we could have half the meat. That was how the families decided to resolve the situation, and so I've never slaughtered an animal. The animal had already died, but it was a matter of skinning it and cleaning it, and it ended up like in a plastic 5-gallon bucket, like most of its parts. And my husband, who's a visual artist, he sat there and painted it like that. Ended up being sort of like Francis Bacon-ish. And I ended up writing a poem that, again, it's the speaker of this poem is not myself. I wouldn't call it a totally distinct persona poem, but it's more like think of it as like a short story, a fictionalized speaker. I watch a man take the skin off a goat and put it on the clothesline to dry. As casual as pulling nylons off, then where the hoof had been, he, curt and tender, wrenches it as if to pull away a bulking lover's skirt. With his forearm, he wipes the sweat from his hairline, receding but still a striking black, then steps back to look at what he's done before the tongue is removed and washed and placed on a hook, while the animal is whole and still in some sense admirable, sickening and carnal. I'm tired of dreams in which I put on the red silk slip, in which I am a part of the needle I use to sew black stitches like blurred mascara over my eyes. Where are my teeth? We're at a cocktail party and all the dresses rustle with the same ruffle of black taffeta. I lean over the bar and ask for mezcal with a lime. The bartender is a severed hand who squeezes seeds into the small glass. I feel a grain of corn stuck in my molar, and I cannot help but probe it. No one's watching. The room is full of priests in black taffeta gathered around the console radio, arguing about whether Jose Alfredo Jimenez had or had not made a deal with the devil. When I slide my tongue across my gums, I feel a hollow and pull out the grain of corn, pinkish white, with roots already beginning to sprout, to crack and lift the temple of my skull. I would have vomited if he hadn't stopped, and with a casual tip of his wrist, offered me a swig of mezcal from a plastic flask. I shake my head no. Jimenez is on the radio, La Mano de Dios. Inside, the man's wife has gone to lie down with stomach cramps, but I know she's leaning over the toilet or she's violently brushing her teeth and her tongue. He begins to pull great handfuls of guts like giant rubber bands out of the goat. Hunkered down to get the angle right, briefly he's drawn in, possessed by the slit belly, before he finishes, hands ladling the pluck into a bucket, spilling none of it on the grass. You know, the storytelling really does take a little bit longer. I sort of got into the rhythm of it after listening to you tell us so many stories, Henry, and I don't usually go that long, but do I have time maybe to read one more poem? Or?
That might be a bad influence.
Maybe so. You know, I was thinking it sort of, I never got to see him read when he was alive, unfortunately, but James Dickey, of course, was famous for his long rambling introductions, and I listened to many of those recordings.
Long rambling, drunken.
Yeah, drunken too, yes, indeed. I've been writing about forests and mushrooms and addiction. Those are the three factors or themes that are sort of coming together. And so the poem that I want to read for you is called Forest Floor. And it's a little bit surreal in parts. I've wanted to become more forest-like. That is, to stretch toward blankness, a sheet pulled too tight at the corners of the twin mattress. Everything is thin, thinned out, I'd say threadbare, and even the air I wrap around myself like a quilt feels cheap and doesn't warm up. All afternoon, eiderdown has been falling here as I walk the O horizon, unplucking itself from the skin of the forest floor, sticking to my arms, little pieces of down so soft they don't seem to have any quill at all until they prick, sudden pricking over my skin, infinitesimal nibs burrowing back into their goosebumps and deeper into the follicle toward muscle, burrowing like earth workers through mulch, through flexors and extensors inside me, brachialis, subclavius, reaching toward lung as if wanting in their burrowing to root deep enough to reach air again, to surface somewhere new and not their own, in a body in the middle of a breath, to fill my lungs with feathers, to make them buoyant, floating on the edgeless skin of a pond, a severed wing I can't cough up. And when I try to explain to the nurse, when she places her hand on my head and says there's no fever, and her face looks almost familiar, a quilt handed down from someone else's grandmother, tucked under my chin on a cold night, and inside it I'm only one invertebrate tuft, small as an oocyte, nearly weightless, poreless, all surface, uninfected with the impulse to touch my own arms, to smooth the skin as if I know the feeling will pass, just a chill. Should I go to one? I guess I lost track of when I started.
One more? Sure. Sure.
This one goes with the one I just read a little bit. It's called Suboxone Sonnets. Suboxone is this medicine that people take after becoming addicted to opiates, and it's a little slip you stick under your tongue for about 20 minutes, and it stops the cravings. And this is something that people who have been very close to me in my life and in my family have had to do, and it's something you have to do for your whole life. And it's there. Yeah, I think there are other ways you can do it, but the sublingual is a very common way to do it. So in some ways, this is a poem about recovery and about being the family member of someone recovering. Suboxone sonnets. First day target dose, little strip tease, slow as a cavity. I've been so good, so accepting lately, of myself like a brother. Baby boy dissolving like Alka-Seltzer, bicarbonate tablets becoming his eyes, and his eyes emptied out, drunk up, bored and sick. Our spine is curved as a labyrinth, a single footpath we follow, then I'm gone, not object of nerve or love, all blood just platelet, listening to someone say swallow. Easy expression to kill the pain, which after all I can't even finger through latex, its aggregate spirit, superorganismic, part craving, part haunting. I've been borderline historical all day, Nostos living inside me like a house. I can't remember in color, but in the smell of cedar inside a chest, mine, cat's cheek, vodka bottle in a sock, attic morning, sick with sun. I've accepted things, tablets, tubes of saline. There's no going back from the slow strum in the vein. Hospital already chthonic, somewhere linear I can't get to. Slick lick of the gutted moon, a stop codon out the back of the rear view, me with cuffs on, night blotto with vomit, mothering me. Who said I couldn't hit her back? There's nothing to relieve me of. Go ahead, search. Feel deep in my pockets for an answer to articulate in me like an artificial hip. Okay, I'll stop there.
Hello. And again, opportunity for asking Laura a question.
I can speak without the microphone. I'm very impressed that you won the T.S. Eliot Award. So why not tell us a little bit more about how you were submitted for it and what the process was, and a little bit more about the award.
Yeah, so so I didn't win the T.S. Eliot Award. I won the T.S. Eliot Prize, which is one is more prestigious than the other, and so thank you. But if you were thinking of the big international prize, that's given to an advanced career poet. This one was an open book prize, and so I submitted this poetry manuscript to a handful of places that typically the way you publish a poetry manuscript your first time around is through a contest. So you say, submit it, a panel of readers read it, they pick finalists, and then a judge picks the winner. And so that's how I won that particular prize, was through a book contest.
Don't poor mouth it.
No, I'm great. I'm absolutely grateful, and they were very. It was Truman State University Press, which they were lovely to work with. I helped, they let me help design the cover, which as I mentioned in my reading, my husband is a visual artist, and so he and I spent a long time thinking about that and how it would sort of open the book. And Arthur Z, who's a wonderful, wonderful poet, is the judge who selected it. He gave me fantastic comments. So the whole process was delightful and lovely and easier than it should have been.
Could you talk about some of the contemporary poets who have inspired you?
Yeah, I like really dark poetry, violent poetry. Bridget Pigeen Kelly is somebody who I often bring into my intro poetry class, usually within the first week. She has so much formal control over what she's doing on the page, and yet She has absolute depth of emotion, and she has an uncanny skill with storytelling too. And the poem I always bring them, and you should go look it up, is called Song. I have been reading, let's see, Layli Long Soldier. Her book, Whereas, is one of my very, very favorites. She's also very formally exciting on the page and sort of theoretically. I like work, so apart from like the dark, violent, unsettling stuff, I also like stuff that might feel disorganized, but it's very controlled in its disorganization. Like it feels like it's following its own rules, and so you come up with something crazy and then you follow through. Monica Yoon's book Blackacre is a really good one that was out recently that's quite formally interesting and pretty dark as well. Anna Maria Hong. Yeah, I can name more. I'm just going to overwhelm the answer with names.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your poem selection process for putting together a manuscript? Like, did you start with, well, I guess in this case you started with the theme, so that helped unify?
Yeah, it was a difficult process. I put all the poems all over my floor, like a big puzzle, and then you can sort of think about them differently and how they work together. And you want the arc in the book. I think the time has passed where you can simply publish a book that is an excellent collection of individual poems, right? That a lot of people are really looking for some kind of cohesion in voice, or some kind of overarching story perhaps, or themes or something, right? Like, not that it has to be gimmicky, and in fact I don't have, even the warp thing feels a little gimmicky to me, but what I wanted to do was draw a reader into a voice right away, and to a place, and to have that voice and place be sort of addicting to a reader, to say, I want to keep reading and I want to keep living in this moment. So I ended up doing it in sections. The first section of poems is a lot of the Mexico poems. Then I do some more formally sort of inventive poems, and then I end with more like space-time. The other thing I do in my work is I'm very interested in science, and I'm interested in how a scientist might approach the understanding of the world in a way that might be similar or overlapped with the way a poet might look at the world. I also want to sort of restore subjectivity to science, because I think that's a myth that we can be fully objective, and I love and trust science, but I'm also very interested in the human side of it. I'm trying to work as part of the poems that I want to make into a book that I read last tonight, trying to do some poems on alcohol addiction studies in mice, and how they give mice bottles of alcohol, of ethyl alcohol, and then sort of watch and track their reactions. And I think thinking about subjectivity outside of human subjectivity, and thinking about experiences outside of human experience, like that to me is both a thematic and a narrative arc, because I want to tell that story, or think about that story, or how I might do it. But yeah, on the floor in piles. And then my cat would come and sit on one, and then she'd move it, because she's a big cat with brusque steps, and it was a battle.
And I'm
so excited to find that there's somebody else who reads the dictionary. I was that child, and I thought I was the only one on the planet.
It's true. It's actually, it's fascinating where, especially if you let it send you, you know, to new entries, and you say, well, now I'm here, but now let me jump. Yeah, it's
Well,
a little
the question
journey.
actually is, I love the way you talk about the word warp. Do you, in reading the dictionary, is that your point of departure? Or, I love your word choice throughout your poems, or do you find yourself going back as the poem evolves and just perusing the dictionary for other ideas as it develops?
With warp, it just I had all of the definitions typed up in a single document, and I might start with the idea of a poem and then have that definition, and I would tease back and forth, and then I would sometimes change the definition or realize that the poem was going somewhere I didn't know, but I really tried to stay contained in that 54 definitions, which is already a lot, and I didn't use all of them. Some of them felt so close to each other that I wanted to thin it a little, otherwise it was just a little heavy-handed. But what was interesting about that set of definitions is they're, you know, so you think of like the of bees, there's one that's of bees to swarm. How is that a definition of warp? And it has to do with the splitting more than, and then that splitting is a reproductive act, actually. And so there are other reproductive definitions as well. And so you see those as sort of coming together in a group, finding their affinities. I thought it was, it was always a back and forth, though.
Thank you.
So there's one.
Another question? Oh, okay, sorry.
When do you know that you have a book of poems?
Good question.
It is a good question, and in some ways, it is just a matter of how many poems do I have that feel done, like that feel ready to live in the world. You know, is it 50 pages worth? Maybe it's a book then, maybe not yet. For me, I knew I had a big file structure and I had big piles of papers on my desk, and it felt like I had a scaffolding and I was just filling in then. And so at any point, I think it could have gone longer or could have shrunk back down a little if I kept fiddling, but I knew I had a beginning and I knew I had an end, and so that I had the book. I think that's when you know. Thank you.
Good evening. Did it work? Okay. Good evening. I'm a student of an older student, and I took this creative writing class from Professor Sam last year, and I read at the poem reading last year, and it was amazing. So I came back this year, and I have an idea for my collection of poems, but I'm not a poet, well, not a published poet, but I have a lot of things that I've done in the past that I've worked with personally myself and with other people on healing from sexual abuse. And it's a subject that's very important to me, and I want to give a voice to those who would be silent. And tonight I have 2 poems, and I'll read them for you. The first one is called One October Evening. It was my senior year, 1973, when I took that ride one October evening on my mighty Schwinn. As the horizon pulled down the blind, blocking the squinting sun, I crossed the Black River Bridge. No boats on the river, no walkers on the walkway, just me and Schwind battling the autumn wind, pedaling back to a time, pedaling back to a place, the silent sanctuary, deserted campground. The silence interrupted, click of a kickstand. I built a home fire in that place, staring at the embers glowing among the ash, thinking of nothing else. I sat in the quiet, I sat alone, framed by the silent pines, lighted by the fire. The moon was my ceiling light. Black sky, a comforter tucked around me, stars at my head. In that place, at that time, I was safe from a memory that would not erase. When the moon was a light bulb and my body was not mine. And this poem is called The Quiet. I breathe in, out, create the quiet. My scars, only ghost in the quiet. Leaves of the willow oak wave, waiting. The wisp wind creating the quiet. Splashes of magenta, blue, and green, while slowly creating the quiet. On a sunny patch of daisy waits dragonfly, creating the quiet. Radiant heat from far, far away heals Deb's soul, creating the quiet. Thank you.
Next is Allie Finch.
Thank you. Okay, so my poem is titled My Last Year. I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to be signing while I speak my poem, so just to prepare you in advance. My last year. The year starts freezing for the last time. Lonely Valentine for the last time. Snow turns to showers, spring begins. Showers to flowers for the last time. Flowers beg for showers, heat rises. Summer is cut short for the last time. Final back to school shopping begins. Leaves fall, days grow short for the last time. Pumpkins, ghosts, and witches come to play. Dressing up with them for the last time. From pumpkins to pies, fake leaves and gourds, families gather for the last time. Lights around the tree, presents exchanged. Visiting families for the last time. Boxes are packed, farewells are given out. Goodbye, my home, not for the last time. Thank you.
Next we have Nate Johnson.
How are y'all doing today? That's good. That's good to hear. Well, you can call me Nate, and my title for this poem is Divine Oceans. Oceans of fear further swarm in the mind, however settle in the presence of light. Corrupt ideas extend to be unkind, only to flee elsewhere from holy might. Beyond the waves stand proud divine glory, never weakened, always moving onward. Settled water now glow in all that's holy. Thoughts fly amongst the ease, moving forward. Fearful habits fail to conquer with force. Iron shackles like pain is lost in time. This settled ocean moved along the course. Before was hard, now a successful climb. Fresh air returns and resides within faith. With joy in the divine is life's new age. Thank you.
Anna Bernard.
All right, well, I'm one of the students who it's definitely their first time up here reciting a poem. Pretty excited. I can say, just to give a little background, I'm obviously not a poet, but I do enjoy poetry. and I typically only get the urge to write some when I have a pivotal moment in my life or an epiphanous moment, something serious going on. Could be good, could be bad, just depends. This is a free verse titled Shards of Hope. These shells that lie upon the sand, waiting to be picked by someone's hand, mostly scattered in shattered disarray, while few remain whole. Although there is beauty in the unbroken, who will find the beauty by assembling the fragments piece by piece? Sharp edges are smooth, each flaw tells a story, making each shard more essential in the story of how the broken can become whole once again. Thank you.
Tyler Mackey.
So I'll go ahead and start the same way Hannah did. I'm not a poet professionally. I do love poetry though I normally only use it to help me work through my own personal feelings. And this is definitely one that's very personal to me, so hope you guys enjoy it. It's called Perfection. I finally found a better way to face your perfect storm today. I will not fight your flawless wrath. I'll use my mind to thwart your pride. I will not feel the gluttonous. I will not show the praise you lust, although that makes you envious. You call us weak and show your greed by demanding that we feed the sloth. Your virtue leads to sin, perfection bleeds despair. Forsaken by your reckless grace, your frightened heart won't leave your space. Look, I know I'll never see the perfect beings will never be, but I wonder, can you see the faithful bend their knee? I hope you one day see the wicked fruits you gave to me, those forbidden fruits that seal your soul, from loving hands untouched by faith, from burdened hands you left disgraced. So atop a ruined spire, atop that once lovely tower, you seethe in darkened misery and hate your faithless flawed. You're broken by a bitter rage and beaten by your hopeless sage. You run and hide and masquerade from heaven, hell, and worldly thought. But I'll be there at your demise. I'll be there for your surprise. You can come at me with righteous flames, and flesh may see it, but words remain. So bound by holy wrath, you fight, yet time and time can't yield our plight. And in the end, I'll meet you there, in those plains with a perfect rest. I'll see your weakened visage. I'll see you eye to eye, equals in death as in life. Thank you.
Kayla Harmon.
A recipe for disaster in 24 lines or less. Step 1, preheat for 9 months, except Mom forgot to check the expiration date on half of the ingredients. And Step 2, add 1 single mom and mix her up, just a cog in the machine of a society built to sustain only the top. And Step 3, add 2 siblings plus 1, I guess that's 3, and have her try to meet all their needs while still sustaining sanity. And just for fun, add 1 teaspoon of something sweet just to have it turn around and beat the entirety of reality. And bake it for some odd teen years just to see what happens when we don't believe our kids have the ability to perceive what they see. And we do as we see, so that leaves Step 4, repeat. A recipe best served generationally. Thank you.
Rebecca Pendleton.
My poem is called This Age. This age is new to me. I sure am not the way I used to be. When I was young, no one told me to revel. I was in a race, racing to finish it, do it. I couldn't take moments, they didn't matter. Then I became aware, hey, slow down. I saw time, it was winning and beating me. My children were growing up. I clung to time's leg like a little girl. Wait, why are you going? No more wishing for life now. No more thinking with my eyes. Vanity, you're no good to me. No more hiding from truths. Old heroes are being replaced. Time has changed not them, but me. Religion was the passion of my youth, but faith is a much kinder way to be.
Those children who longed for me and trusted me, they've been replaced too. Strong and beautiful people, the glory of me, have taken their place, and I am proud. My eyes are now piercing, but not so perfect. Not old, not young, but I can now see. I understand that old me and sympathize often for the girl in a hurry. She was so awkward. A fresh new heart at middle age, filled to overflowing as life begins all over, and this time, not in a hurry.
Christopher Madrano.
Good evening, everyone. I'm pretty new to poetry as well. This class is like my first time really being exposed to it. I was never really into it, but as time goes on and I'm, being exposed to it more and more, I'm really starting to grow to like it. So I'm going to be sharing a tanka with you guys. I titled it "Words Will Never Be Released." Like a tea kettle, steam begging to be released. Extinguish the flame. Brimming and overflowing, words will never be released. Thank you.
Val Pacific.
Good evening, everybody. I've already had a career in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a fish and wildlife biologist, and when I first went to college, I had two options. One was to be a biologist, which I really love, to save the world, save the habitats, or become a writer. And at that time, I was narrowly looking at people like Hemingway and writing novels, and I thought I would probably starve if I became a writer. So I went into the biology field. So I worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service for 33 years, and I saw a lot of wetlands being destroyed, especially at the beginning of my career. And we've really lost the majority of the wetlands in the United States. And that means a lot of land has been lost to flood control, wildlife, and pollution control, and so on. So the title of my first poem is "The Marsh." The marsh. I sat upon a flattened rock, my mind ablaze with pain. The marsh I'd seen 1,000 times was ruthlessly destroyed today. They pushed some dirt from a giant pile into the muddy fen. A frog leapt up and tried to flee, but he couldn't get away. Along the shore, some fishes lolled, hiding among the reeds. The dozer pushed the dirt so fast, it squashed them into the muck. A turtle lazing upon a log, warming himself in the sun, stretched his head to its full extent. Too late, it was smashed by a rock. A female mallard near the shore, protecting her new hatched chicks, covered them over with outstretched wings. but they all in turn were covered by dirt. A beaver gliding toward the shore to fell a tree for a dam, slapped its tail in sudden alarm. Too late, it was crushed in the mass. A great blue heron quietly fished, but the loud sound of the men made the bird drop its prey, and it flapped away in fright. All this I watched in horror. A tear came to my eye. The men were pointing at a bird, laughing to hear its cry. Within the marsh life blooms so lush, but must be left alone. Greedy men don't comprehend our very lives depend on such. I came back to my senses then. I thought of all the good the marsh had done for me, and now it never would. That marsh had kept my home flood free, from my well drank water clean, and spent hours watching birds. Forever gone that scene. Thank you. I've got another one that I wrote in 2008, and I went to the Montpelier in Charlottesville, Virginia. They have a landmark forest, and while I was in the forest itself, it's an old growth stand that James Madison planted and never touched, so it's one of the few old growth places that you can see old growth timber. And while I was there, walking the trail, this landmark trail, I wrote the poem while I was right there. It's called Ode to James Madison Forest. Sounds of silence I wept to hear, dappled light through trees so dear. Down from the canopy a leaf fell sere, twisted broken logs from litter silently peer. Straight-laced giants with no fear, proclaiming triumphantly, we are here. Oaks and hickories that once served man, now still and peaceful, a regal clan. Deeper in I trod, as first Indians began. Will I meet a colonial? In my mind I can. One behemoth fell, arms flailed like a fan. Even for these monsters, death is not a ban. Thank you.
That's Fragrance. Beth is not a student at Germanna, by the way.
Well, the first thing I would like to say is it has been an honor to be in the company of this wonderful group of students. You all are absolutely amazing, and I think you should all give yourselves a round of applause. We are coming upon the Halloween season. So, for this first poem, I would like to share with you a little background about the ruins of a castle on the Isle of Skye
called Duntuilm Castle. Hugh MacDonald was thrown into the dungeon of this dreadful place in 1601 after he plotted to overthrow his chieftain. Some of his cohorts ended up down there as well. And the practice was to throw the offending person into the dungeon, slam the door shut, and leave them to starve to death. Local legends say that the ghosts of those who suffered this fate still shriek among the ruins of Duntuilm Castle. So I would invite you to get into the mood of this somewhat spooky poem, if you like, to close your eyes and imagine being entombed in a dungeon with absolutely no light. In the dungeon of Duntuilm Castle. And you will hear a couple of words from the Scots that you might not be familiar with. The laird is the male owner of a large estate in Scotland. And reeves, R-E-I-V-E-S, is an old term for plunders that's not in common use in English. The dungeon of Duntuilm Castle. Wailing winds of sky cut the heart with cry for bread, crust of rye in tortured dreams. Lads who would betray their laird plead and pray, fettered limbs decay as time unseams. Demon hunger hones ligaments and bones, buried under stones that crushed their schemes. Seaside cliffs are steep, dungeon tunnels deep. Madness reaves their sleep, but not their screams. Thank you. This next one, costume change. Some of you may be familiar with the story of the princes in the Tower. Anybody here been to the Tower of London? A couple of people. Great. Well, in 1674, two skeletons were unearthed in the White Tower, and they were presumably the remains of King Edward IV's sons. Edward died in 1483, and the boy's uncle, who later became known as Richard III, ascended to the throne, but there was some castle intrigue. The former king's heir, Edward, who was 12, and his brother, 9-year-old Richard, were guests in the Tower of London. And after Richard put them there, they disappeared and were never heard from again until the skeletons were unearthed later. So this is entitled The Princes in the Tower. No torch dispels the dark that dwells in tower cells where hinges groan. They are mere boys, enthralled by toys, but greed destroys the blood and bone that would be king, thus menacing what lust would wring from scepter, throne, and jeweled crown. In London town, a wraith in gown of white is known to haunt the stair, where royal heir and brother share a bed of stone in damp and gloom. Though lamps illume this secret tomb, where horrors hone collective fright, the boundless might that birthed this blight we have foreknown. Thank you.
And Madeline Nichols.
I'm Madeline Bickle, and I write poetry under M.E. Jackson, and I write cozy mysteries under Madeline E. Jackson, both available at Amazon.com. End of commercial. Anybody who knows me will tell you there's three things I talk about, and when you're 73 years old, you can talk about anything you want. And that's Marshall University football, my grandson Joshua, and Washington Nationals baseball. I had planned to read some West Virginia in poetry, but after 2 nights of sleep deprivation due to baseball game that went into midnight, I decided to share with you a poem I wrote last summer when Juan Soto, number 22, left field for the Washington Nationals, first came to bat at the age of 19. The poem is a little long. It's titled Ruminating About Baseball and Poetry. You'll like it. I was flipping through the pages of the newest collection of poetry while watching baseball, probably not giving needed attention to either, but abhorring boredom. The poetry left me thinking, the baseball left me wanting to see a home run from the home team. I laid the book on the couch and moved to the computer. I could type and think and watch TV while trying to compose my thoughts. Things just improved. The home team started hitting, and the new kid in town hit a home run with 3 RBIs. His first time to bat in a major league game when the first ball sailed over the plate. He ran the bases to a standing ovation. He was 19, barely. The runs keep coming, the dry spell is over, even with many of the regular players sitting on the bench, massaging aching muscles and pulled hamstrings. Maybe if I leave the computer and open the book, the poetry will score better with me. It's not easy to reach the heart of an old fan who has lived forever and finds there's nothing new under the sun or the moon or the stars. All the old guys look the same, leaning out from their loge seats with toothless smiles while thinking some sashaying female will look their way, or a pop-up will reach their outstretched arms. At least the home team is winning. If only the poet's words could strike a note. No, not a strike. Maybe a home run with a few hunks on base to wave while they run by, and the organ player has everyone singing, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." Did you know they changed the words from when we sang it back in the days when baseball parks had character and ivy-covered walls and kids could peek through cracks and watch the game for free? Now we go to the game and pay $100 for 2 tickets. More to park than money for drinks and dogs with sauce. Remember how we made fun of our grandparents talking about the old times in the war? They lamented on how much their kids had to pay for a house and a car when they could fill the tank for $5, and everybody drove a car with a clutch and a small button on the floor to dim bright lights. Back to reality. The home team has a huge lead, and the book of poetry is spread open like a bulldog's back legs. It would be crying for attention if it had a tongue and a larynx, even though it has a voice, if you listen. I'll finish reading the poems and stay tuned until the end of the 9th, but I'd rather turn off the TV, close a book of verses, don a worn t-shirt, and read a thriller while huddled under the bed covers, eating a Reese's cup.